Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Farmland Drainage and Environment Conference for 2021-22. My name is Jeff Olson, the Managing Director with the Citizens Environmental Alliance here in Saskatchewan. The Citizens Environmental Alliance was created to address the issue of farmland drainage and its impact on the environment in Saskatchewan. And we are collaborating with other like-minded organizations to bring you this conference. The collaborating organizations are the Culling Lakes Eco Museum, Ducks Unlimited Canada, Eco-Friendly Saskatchewan, Last Mountain Lake Stewardship Group, Lower Capel Watershed Stewards, National Farmers Union, Nature Saskatchewan, Provincial Pastures Provincial Interests, the Provincial Association of Resort Communities in Saskatchewan, Sierra Club Canada, which is Prairie Chapter, and the Saskatchewan Alliance for the Water Sustainability, along with the Saskatchewan Environmental Society. The organizers would like to acknowledge that the land we are on is the traditional First Peoples land and located on the homeland of the Plains and Woods Cree, Assiniboine, Saulteaux, Tenasserim, and Stoney peoples, and the traditional territory of the Dakota, Lakota Sioux, and the Métis people. In the spirit of and the intent of reconciliation, we acknowledge and recognize that Canada's Indigenous peoples are caretakers of Mother Earth and respect the gifts of water, air, and fire. We recognize and support that First Nations people have a special relationship with the earth and the environment and all living things within it. A few housekeeping notes before we get started. Your mics will be on mute. We'll be able to, during the question and answer period, open the mics for you to ask questions if you care to, or you can ask questions through the chat box. Together we have this is a discussion panel. We have three distinguished people for this discussion. I'll just introduce all three to you. Dr. Catherine Arbuthnot is a professor emerita of psychology at Champion College in the University of Saskatchewan, in the University of Regina. She is a conservation psychologist, which is a field that works to understand and improve people's connection to the natural world. Since she's been retired, Dr. Arbuthnot promotes nature connection and experience wherever she can, works with others to preserve and increase and appreciate the old growth grasslands, which are the most endangered and least protected ecosystems in Canada and other areas of the world. Secondly, we have Dr. Margot Hurlburt. Dr. Hurlburt is a Canadian Research Chair in Climate Change, Energy and Sustainability Policy at the Johnson Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy at the University of Regina. Her scholarship concerns climate change, energy, Indigenous peoples, water, droughts, floods, water governance, and sustainability, and she's an intergovernmental panel on climate change author. Last but not least, Dr. Roger Petrie is a professor of philosophy at Luther College at the University of Regina, teaching in the areas of ethics, sustainable development, and philosophies of religion. Dr. Petrie is co-coordinator of the Regional Center of Expertise on Education for Sustainable Development in Saskatchewan and co-leads the International Association of Universities Higher Education Cluster on Responsible Consumption and Production. With that, I've got some questions that we're going to be asking, and we'll be we're going through those just as a discussion point. We'll start with Dr. Petrie. Generally, landowners have a mindset that they own the land and that they individually ultimately have total control of the land. and that, you know, essentially if society wants the benefits that come from there, such as habitat and that sort of thing, that society should maybe pay for them, paying for the example ecological goods and services. Even though, like in the case of wetland drainage, their drainage supersedes the downstream water quality impacts to their neighbors. Where does this mindset come from, and is it cultural or ethical or that sort of thing? Roger?
Sure. I think I'll probably speak mostly to the ethical side of things. So, of course, it really is tied to the notion of property rights, right? If we're talking about ownership. And when we think about property rights, we can think about it in two ways. We can think about the ethical or the moral rights to property and the responsibilities there, and we can distinguish that from the legal rights, property rights. And Margot, I'm sure, will talk about the legal side of things. So I'll talk about the ethical side of things. So if we ask, well, what's the underlying value that people care about in terms of owning property? The deeper concern is autonomy, right? So freedom from interference so that you can determine your own life, but also freedom to make meaningful choices and sort of plan things out over the long term. And that's a good thing. But when we talk about it from an ethical perspective, it's not just my own autonomy that matters, right? If we care about autonomy, we care about everybody's autonomy. And so that may be an issue here, because sometimes if the landowner is thinking, well, it's only my autonomy that matters and other people's autonomy doesn't matter, then they're not really thinking about it from an ethical perspective. It's more just maybe just straight self-interest or something like that. And so we also need to think about autonomy as one of several different types of ethical concerns. All right, so we can talk about maximizing human happiness, which might grow beyond autonomy, or the happiness of other species. I mean, there's a lot of other ethical dimensions that we might want to care about. The other thing too is a lot of farms are no longer just family farms, right? Families have broad ethical accountabilities of a kind, but corporations do too. And so if you're an incorporated landowner, you have been granted a lot of privileges by the state, by society, on how you operate. And there are ethical obligations about managing assets and risks, and also how you do that in a law-abiding way that doesn't harm others. And so your point about potentially harming the autonomy of other landowners to use their property well, right? So if you have a whole bunch of water moved onto your land, so even though you wanted to manage water properly and use your autonomy interests well, you're unable to, all right? So that's part of it. The other thing too is when we talk about property rights, it's actually often a bundle of rights, and there are different types of properties. So, you know, if we think about the water that's on the land in terms of who owns that, well, that's citizens of the province. And so if we're harming the water quality, for example, or the wetlands that ensure that water quality, we're actually harming the autonomy interests of your fellow citizens in terms of the water quality. So I think there are a lot of things we need to think about there. And then finally, there's the ethics that has to do with the transfer of property. All right. So when Canada basically acquired Western Canada, they did it under treaties. And so there are moral obligations implied in making treaties around, you know, hunting and fishing rights and so on. And so when the government then transferred that land to private landowners, they couldn't do it in a way that violated the ethics of those earlier treaties. And so if we eliminated all of the wetlands in southern Saskatchewan, where are any contributions to fishing and hunting rights of First Nations people? So the ethics transferred along, if you can think of it that way. The government of Canada could not have transferred full ownership and complete control. And so that's another key issue. So a bunch of things there.
Yeah, no, that's good. Following along with that a bit on the aspect of the law, Margot. So what creates the mindset of essentially flaunting the laws or ignoring them when it comes to wetland drainage, when it's draining wetlands, that you know, they know that there's laws stopping that, and usually for good reasons. That but a majority of the farmers, in fact 95% in Saskatchewan's that are doing this drainage are doing it illegally without license. What would you suggest would be the reason this mindset is?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jeff, and probably a question too that Dr. Arbuthnot wants to speak to. Why do we break laws? But I'm going to give an answer that's really glib and then expand on it. And my answer is it's complicated. So we like to talk about drainage laws, which are less complicated because we've always had requirements in law to get licenses to drain our agricultural land, our lands onto our neighbors' lands, et cetera, to get permits, et cetera. But I think we can all acknowledge that water and life on prairie agricultural land is complicated. And we get floods that come up and ag producers and urban communities have to respond to them within hours, minutes, days, and they're really not thinking about drainage, getting drainage permits when we're in the midst of the throes of a flood event. So we also, I really love Dr. Petrie's description of property and private property and our rights. And it's really important because I think that overshadows a lot of the water law and the other laws that might apply and the policies that are coming to the fray. So we tend to think of agricultural land as that bundle of property rights, which are generally, I get to exclude people from my property, right? Is the biggest right that's part of that bundle, is being able to keep off trespassers, people from posting signs to keep off hunting, trapping, fishing, all those types of rights that we have in property. But what we're not thinking about is water law. And we've got this other body of water law, which comes from Britain. It's not really fit for purpose for the Saskatchewan landscape. So Britain, which has got very defined historical rivers and wetlands, it came up with these riparian water laws, which are part of Canadian law because we're part of the British Commonwealth, which are amended somewhat from some of the Water Acts of Canada and the Saskatchewan Water Acts, but some of the principles are still applying. So generally, like the bed of a lake, like Lake Diefenbaker, it's owned by the government or by the Crown, right? But what we don't talk about is when the Quill Lakes happened and all of a sudden we had some wetlands became a huge lake, we would never suggest that that lake was now owned by the government and not by the private property owners that historically own the land. And it's complicated because waters in the prairies, they recede, they're there, and then they recede, especially because of our flat topography and our pothole topography as well. So it's complicated. We don't really have a great set of understandable, cohesive laws that apply in all events to rivers, lakes, wetlands, et cetera, et cetera. So Saskatchewan, we're looking for a wetland policy that might be very authoritative, saying that all agricultural producers or all agricultural landowners have to retain all of their wetlands or retain a proportion of their wetlands or have no net loss of their wetlands. So we're thinking again in terms of what I call dialectics, which is like either it's one way or the other way. So we're looking for something that's very top down and going to be enforced by the government, but then it's going to take government enforcement and regulatory power to actually make it work on the landscape. And we've had about 100 years of drainage laws that haven't worked so well in the past. So not sure why passing a somewhat contradictory law to drainage would be thought of as an immediate fix, that people are all of a sudden going to line up and abide by wetland laws and policies, and that it would actually result in protection of our wetlands. So I'm not sounding very optimistic on this, but I actually do have cause for optimism. But it comes at it from a different way. And part of it is thinking instead of private or common properties. So instead of thinking of it as either private landowners or of the people, it's common property of water, which seems to always be at clash, but to think of it more as cultural heritage, think of it more as a movement between the two and a relationship that isn't all one, a public good, and isn't all the other, a private, that it actually is informed by both. And we do have some policies and ideas that are coming up that protect it. We already have the Farmland stewardship program, and it's not great, but it's a start. So we are rewarding financially farmers for protecting grazing and doing it properly in riparian areas. And there's money attached to it. So we have programs that we might be able to augment that are already on the ground to try and protect some of these wetlands if we can do it in a scaled up manner. We have the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, so free, prior, informed consent. So where we want to actually have development and big drainage conglomerates like the Conservation in Districts Act, or even the current licensing provisions for drainage of contiguous landowners, we have free, prior, informed consent of Indigenous people, which is, again, another way of looking at this. Is not all private, not all public, but actually a mixture in between. I also like to look at the carbon pricing that's starting to happen, and we don't talk about this enough in agricultural practice. And when we have all of these great new applications on our phones for profitability of farming practices, which are really taking off, why don't we have nature's contributions and evaluate nature's contribution, or thinking about carbon pricing and how valuing carbon retained in wetlands and water management will eventually, with carbon pricing, be effected with accounting, verification, or reporting that's coming down at us with some of our goals of achieving net zero by 2050. So if we can ramp these up, there's a lot of work being done on nature's contributions and the ability of our land to actually store carbon and attain our Paris goals, which is going to have money ascribed to it eventually in the policy sphere. So if we can bring that into the actual agricultural producers' calculations of profitability in a way now so that they're thinking about it, I think we have these little windows of opportunity for opening up the discussion and moving away from just a black and white private property and ethical responsibility of commons. So I think I've talked enough. I've got a few other ideas, but maybe I'll leave it for discussion.
Yeah, we'll probably get into it. And like you said, it's complicated. On to Catherine, regarding the same sort of area, and speaking to the question just asked of Margot, but expand on how do we, and not all landowners are bad people. In fact, most are good people, I'll say. And they have land stewardship and management ideas that are good, but where did they, or how did they learn that good land stewardship and management is better than following the drainage tracks of doing what they need to do to make profit?
Again, an excellent question. And I'm actually going to pick up on things that both Roger and Margot talked about, because, of course, ethics and laws are about human connection and human society and living together and living as well as possible. So psychology really is embedded in all of the things that they've already talked about. So we learn our ideas of stewardship like we learn any other cultural ideas, which is from the people that we live with. So there's childhood experiences that particularly people in rural areas get lots of connection to land and what it is and how to interact about it. So that comes with it some idea of stewardship and what it is and what are the resources in the land. How am I connected to it? How is it connected to me? So we learn that the same way as we learn everything else, basically, in terms of our societal ideas, our values, what the laws of the land are, etc. And they change throughout our life because, of course, the context changes. We've got different ideas about what it is to be a good person now than we did 40 years ago, etc. And our ideas will change with the context depending on our group. We're a highly groupish species, that we connect with people we consider people like us. So Margot's question about why do we abide by and violate laws, our groups have different ideas about what it means to be a good person in particular situations. And so we will probably be pretty consistent with the high ethics and values and of our group. So that's one important thing to kind of keep in mind, especially in these days where we really highlight those group boundaries and differences. So I want to sort of touch on something that Roger said, because from the perspective of psychology, in addition to different connections of values, research indicates that we actually have different needs in order to be healthy. One of them is autonomy, that every person, no matter what kind of group or culture they belong to, wants to experience that they have some choice in their own actions. So autonomy is really an important sense for all of us to feel like we're living well. But we also have an equally important need for community, to be part of connections and relationships and neighbors, and that those can sometimes be in conflict. So in terms of the drainage laws, sometimes we experience a conflict between autonomy, I can do what I want with my land, and connection, but that has some impact on my reputation in the community. And what do my neighbors think about that? And do I drive them away, which wouldn't be good for me either. Rural communities already are splintered enough. So we've got these two kinds of goals, both of which are very important to us. And so we will have learned values about each of them. Our groups will have different ideas, and we will make different decisions based on which of those goals is kind of in the front of our mind right now. So if I'm thinking, as Margot talks about common areas and public good and my community thriving, my group thriving, agricultural producers or all of that, then I will make maybe a different decision than if I'm just thinking about, oh, gee, how do I make a living for my family this year and maximize the profit. So our goals and our needs are really important to think about because we have a bunch of them and they will lead to different ideas. So I don't think we need to make any attributions about people not being good stewards. That I bet I wouldn't find a Saskatchewan agricultural producer that didn't have land stewardship as part of their ethics. It just means something different depending on what goal I'm thinking about.
Good. Sort of following on that, Catherine. So what would be the best ways, and I guess from my perspective, the amount of stewardship that we see is, like you say, varied from very little or minor set to a great set. How would we encourage people to gain more of that stewardship mindset to look after the environment at least equally and balancing that way?
Well, Again, this will be a little bit different depending on which group you belong to or what your cultural ideas about what does a good person do in this situation. But one of the things I think is really important because of what Margot said about our local conditions and things being really different and complicated, and they vary by where you live and what the situation is right now where you live. That thinking about productive conversations and communications. So not building on the differences between us, but working on the commonality. So not insulting people. That's a bad idea because nobody who is a healthy human being will tolerate that, right? We'll jump right away to autonomy and want to defend ourselves. So you want to kind of nudge people more towards that common connection, social side. And we can do that by actually thinking about what are their goals, what are their needs, what are their interests, and how is that common to other people? Because they will have those goals, it just may not be front of mind. And so being very respectful and thoughtful and actually considering other people's perspective and finding the goals that we have in common, as Margot talked about, in terms of common interests and common interests in our laws, that's the best way, I think. So to do it very much locally with the community that you've got, which will be of different groups, but still sharing those common things.
Right, locally versus, trying to do it province-wide and that sort of thing. Following along with that then, Margot, and I know, it's about a carrot and stick sort of idea, but, people, I think we always prefer the carrot, but we think that there needs to be a stick at time. And in fact, we have the legislation for it. So do you see that we can impose stewardship on landowners through this legislation, or and do you have some examples of that it works, or it really doesn't work?
Yeah, great question, Jeff. And I, in the Western Canadian, Western North American context, I have not come upon a case where I've found top-down impositions on preserving wetlands, or most of them are more like Alberta's, like the net zero, no net loss of wetlands, because again, of the always changing topology of water and land that happens in our flat prairies. Not good track record for literature that actually documents that these policies have worked or even prevented no net loss because of counting and change on the prairies. So I'm personally not a real key lobbyist or proponent of these top-down wetland policies that are isolated from drainage. I'm leveraging off what Catherine said, that it's the discussions that happen with the groups and the landscape planning that is needed to address at the same time both the drainage and the wetlands. And generally it's more than, well, historically it's always been more than one agricultural producer, but now that we're getting into these mega farms that often are owned by corporate owners, maybe that dynamic is changing. So maybe my on the land experience of talking to farmers, when we get into the landscape of very large farms, maybe it's different. But for the most part, it has been, in my experience in the last few decades, when agricultural producers and communities come together to discuss landscape planning. And my research is generally in the context of climate change, which means the land and the water is always dynamically changing. So that's something that has to be addressed, and more in policy and governance, less so in the legal structures. We're looking at what are the adaptive governance practices that allow for our change because of climate change, but also our changing development, our changing patterns, but retain the stewardship and the wetlands and the carbon that we want stored in that land, in that constant dynamic of change. Because we've got enough science, we have enough certainty that we know what we know. We know we need grasslands to store carbon, and we know a lot about how that's done. And we know a lot about carbon stored in our reservoirs, in our water bodies, and in our wetlands. We know we need to do more of that. We've got a lot of questions and uncertainty around like peatlands and climate change and change over time. And we shouldn't let any of those outstanding questions prevent us from doing what we need to do now, which is keeping that carbon stored, retaining those wetlands. So I'm looking for a narrative that moves us past drainage versus wetlands, moves us past that into a common purpose, what Catherine's talking about, a common value system that's not group identity based. So I see private property, agricultural producer, the right to farm as one subset, and then we tend to see the wetlands environmentalists often as another. But if we bring it together and think more about achieving net zero by 2050, and what does that mean in our natural landscapes, and what does healthy water mean, and how does the agricultural drainage and the municipal sewage overflows from floods, like how does this impact us, and how can we get together? Because we know a lot about the symbiotic nature of wetlands from our Avonlea project, that there's certain things we can do with municipal sewage and wetlands. So if we could bring this all together, there'd be these great conversations we could be having around the landscape, storing carbon, and the policies that I've mentioned. And one last one. If you look at waterfowl, like we've done a really good job in certain species and certain protection of habitat, and maybe it's not great, but if we move into these wetlands and these messy spaces that we just leave to nature, they're really important for wind breaks and dust breaks. We've learned this from the 1930s. They're really important for biodiversity and for the ability of our species to hop between areas of wildland. So if we can, group together with that common purpose of maintaining the heritage of our wetlands, the heritage of our pothole topography, our Hudson Bay lowlands, and think about what it is that's important to us, the songbirds that are there, then we start maybe thinking beyond that dialectic of profit versus conservation.
Okay, so that's good, and I think we'll sort of explore the idea around absentee landowners, corporate farming, and that sort of mindset a little later. Roger, I have a question. Linking this. This is a great discussion regarding the aspect of some farmers saying, we're feeding the world, that sort of thing. And, how does that relate to the expense of our society's needs and values for wetland or natural area preservation? Like that farmers make it as a good argument that they're feeding the world, and yet, at what cost?
Right. Well, I guess, feeding the world is certainly an ethically important thing, right? And, people being fed is an essential part of what it means to survive. But on the other hand, again, ethics is about motives. And is that actually the motive of the company or the organization? If it is, you probably find it in its incorporating documents, right? Or if it's a nonprofit dedicated to this, or if it's just primarily profit motive, and this is just an aside, then that isn't really the central motive. So we can ask. You would have to look at what the kind of company it is. Is this part of your triple bottom line that you want to feed the world? And of course, then there are other things too. If those moral concerns are things you want to build into your company, then you would see it in other areas as well, right? I mean, and if the concern is food, we do have to care about the fact that if we're getting rid of other people's hunting and fishing rights, particularly to Indigenous peoples, if food was your concern and you're not even willing to feed your neighbor, then that's a pretty, then that probably isn't your motive. At least we have some needs around food and food production. The other thing I think that's important is, wetlands are all about storing water on the land. And the idea of moving water off the land as rapidly as possible and thinking about how that water could be used for food production with alternative methods of agricultural innovation, all right? So if we are really concerned with maximizing food production, we'd want to look at the science behind how wetlands help improve food production. We'd also want to look at the time horizons, right? It's not simply providing food for in the next 3 years, it's how do we sustain these systems, and they are systems over the long term to maximize the soil quality so that you produce more food, all right? So those are a few things there. I think another thing we need to think about is if it is about food issues, then we also have serious distribution issues, right? Food distribution, getting to the right people, food waste, that's a major ethical concern. And so we'd want to talk about, well, is there a role in the producer somehow in looking at those food distribution systems globally, which could be worth doing. And so I guess the thing is, if we really care about maximizing food production, we do need to set it into a larger ethical context of all the other ethical things we need to care about too. But we also need to think about, let's face it, we're draining water. Water is a valuable commodity. Maybe we're not doing things quite the right way. We've got more sunshine, more growing season, more water on the land, and our current model of production, which says, let's get rid of the water right away and introduce cereal crops. Maybe the better way of maximizing food production is storing the water on the land, getting a whole bunch of these displaced farmers from climate change coming to Saskatchewan, maybe renting portions of land from existing farmers, repopulating our local communities, and maybe moving into vegetable production or other types of more labor-intensive production, right? So I think if that is the core concern, I'm not sure it's being expressed ethically in as holistic a way as it should be.
Yeah, especially when it comes to, is it truly food production or is it, ethanol production for driving our vehicles? That would be a big question. And this related totally toward Brandimir's discussion last night. And if anybody wished, they should listen to that about the shift and change in what agriculture needs to or should do for their own good. Catherine, we're in a developed country. Can landowners here accept that their land is also a public good, regardless of ownership, because of the ecosystem services that are being provided for all of us?
Well, of course, we can. It's well within our intellectual and ethical capacity to do that. Whether that gets highlighted at moments of decision or not is really the question. So again, a couple of things that both Roger and Margot have talked about. I really want to build on Margot's idea that we find some way to just move beyond the groups and think about our common purpose. Because in fact, both of those things are important to us, right? Our autonomous decisions about what to do and how to manage water on our land, but also how that works in the collective. Nobody wants to see Saskatchewan become a failed state because we have mismanaged all of these valuable resources. So both of those goals are active, always in people's minds. And so it's a way to help that come into the conversation so that we don't shut down, but rather use the diversity of opinions, of experience about how to manage those complicated issues of, food distribution, food production, carbon sequestration, all of that. And one of the things that we can kind of keep in mind as we try to facilitate that is that we are amazing social learners. That's one of our sort of excellent, unique things about human beings, is that we learn from each other so well, which is partly why we're so successful. We're always on the lookout for good tricks, and a good trick will be something that solves or satisfies multiple goals at the same time, rather than putting them in conflict with each other. So Margot talked about early on, she talked about ideas of regenerative agriculture, and that those are ways to both maximize profitability and autonomy, but also the long-term sustainability. It kind of meets short-term and long-term goals at the same time. That's a really good trick. And so if we can show examples of that, highlight people that are doing it, which is actually happening through workshops and things like this, people will learn about that. As long as you haven't pulled up their defensive, protecting their group identity and values kind of thing. So we're very bad at that, of evoking that in each other. And so if we could mute that down and highlight that really we're interested in all of these things, all of us are, and develop that. So I would kind of reframe your question as, can we learn that our land is also a societal good? Well, when we're thinking about other goals, we already know that, right? That I want clean water. And I know that clean water is not just something that I can make for myself. I need the cooperation of other people in my neighborhood. It's just that when I'm thinking about what am I going to do right now with canola prices so high and, et cetera, making all of that I'm not really thinking about that other goal. So those are the kinds of things I think we need to be thinking about, is how do we bring all of that to the table without chasing anybody away?
Yeah, that's perfect point. It's about doing it together, not about doing it separately. Margot, you mentioned about wetland policy and the fact that Saskatchewan doesn't actually have one. Manitoba and Alberta has come up with it. Saskatchewan's really having a hard time of it getting it. How does policy affect laws and vice versa?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Jeff. And I think all of us here have kind of been talking in a sociological recognition that decision-making on the Saskatchewan landscape happens, and law is this firm structure that informs it. But it doesn't necessarily coalesce with every single decision that's made, whether it's because of lack of knowledge of the law or lack of awareness that it applied in a certain context. And sometimes this is a good thing. So we were studying the 2001 drought that happened in Saskatchewan and Alberta. And in Alberta, they have a very, very dogmatic first in time, first in right water rights policy, so that when they had a shortage, it would have been the oldest licensees that received their water allocation and not the newer ones. And actually in the crisis moments, because you only have a few months in the spring when your water drought is coming at you through the Saskatchewan River, they actually didn't pay any attention to this first in time, first in right system, but got together in many communities and figured out what they were going to do with these great shortages. And there were some transfers and payments that did occur, using water as market for sure, but there was a lot of common discussion, common purpose, and resolution of the issue of drought within the time frame that it had to be resolved. So you can't wait for courts and laws to happen. So law is kind of that firm infrastructure, and it's really important to get it right, but it's really important not to have it as an obstacle to allowing some really good things to happen on the ground. And the Alberta water legislation allowed for transfers of water interests, which many were opposed to, thinking, well, that makes water a market good, and we don't want that, right? But in this situation, it was actually a good thing. Saskatchewan has that ability as well, but the reality is our water in our river systems, we're never going to make it or try and follow the Chilean example of making water a private good and thinking that the market's going to rule. Like, anyone that's anywhere near water or knows anything about Chile just knows that that has not worked. It's completely insane. So we've got a water law that is actually pretty good with our government water security agency managing it, but again, it's complicated. So we need more on the landscape in the watershed organizations to have these informed civil discussions around issues, preferably before they arise. But, you know, not always. So the 2001 drought, it happened when it happened, but we have a lot of really good work in watershed groups that go on. So if we can have that common discussion always ongoing about, well, what would we do if? So the drought monitor is showing us that Western United States and a lot of places in the prairies are expecting or anticipating drought. Now, I know with our great snow that this is changing moment by moment, but having that discussion about, well, what if we had this significant drought again that they're talking about, and how are we going to balance this out as recipients of water, and how is it going to impact our water quality systems? So this is the place where coming up with policies can start. So instead of expecting some policymaker in Regina to come up with something that's going to fit for purpose in all of our very different landscapes in Saskatchewan, having the different groups and recognizing the diversity of what goes on in our prairie landscape and into our northern parts and our permafrost, I think is really, really important. So just like I definitely couldn't talk about northern Saskatchewan with any modicum of intelligence, I think that's why we need people in the actual regions to be thinking about policies appropriate to that region. And then when you think about bringing that policy up, it's important. But having said that, in 1995, we had a wetland policy that went missing. So in a way, you need policy to somehow get reflected in some sort of regulation, so you don't lose sight of it or track of it when Crown corporations or governments change. So you want some sort of hook in your regulatory environment for all that good work that happens on the ground to try and build this adaptive policy that we need.
Yeah, it seems sometimes that the governments try to do it internally and then they'll consult on it. Well, when they sort of got it all laid out the way they see it, right? And, you know, I think it's going to be important to get society involved in that sooner than later, and almost from the get-go to start developing that wetland policy versus internally. And then, you know, what do you think about this? And, you know, the environmental people can't live with things, and the agricultural can't live with, versus everyone as a community, you know, coming with that. Roger, so can landowners voluntarily adapt to societal views? What ethical or other reasons might require them to do so, or move to there?
Right. Yeah, well, I mean, certainly, I mean, you would think with private property, right, that you could do a lot, right? It's your property, you can do it. But I think we have to realize the market constraints, just the sheer dominance of the market and how that influences individual producers. All right. So, you know, if you have lax enforcement of laws in terms of permits, then of course you are competing against, if you're the ethical farmer, you'll go out and get the permit, but you're competing against others who are not getting permits. And so their cost of doing business is lower than your cost of doing business. They're acquiring land for no payment, effectively, right? I mean, it's basically private expropriation of land that used to provide public ecological services and benefits, all right? And so, if you've a profit motivated business and the laws aren't being enforced, or you're competing against other groups where that isn't, then that's a huge issue. The second thing, and so you get this race to the bottom when there aren't certain minimal standards being enforced. The other thing, of course, is, in terms of water movement, if you're a downstream farmer, you want to store water on your land, maintain your wetlands, but then all of a sudden you've got a huge amount of water coming from upstream that how do you manage your own wetlands, but then have all of this extra water? So you wanted to do the right thing, but you're prevented because of the cumulative impacts of all of the other producers beside you. And so you can't make a good choice. The other thing too is if you want to differentiate your product in the market, right? So say you want to say, look, I'm preserving my wetlands because I feel there are wider social benefits and these sorts of things, but the grain that I'm selling from my preserved wetlands cannot get a higher market price in the market because my grain is just counted like anybody else's grain, right? And so there's no markers to differentiate it. And of course, you end up getting serious contestation from other producers when you start saying, no, I want to be able to show that I'm doing the right ethical thing so that my ethical consumers can pay me a premium because it costs me maybe more to do that. And the European Union, for instance, has programs whereby they say, look, we want to certify your products coming in as basically farmers who preserve their wetlands. And the other, of course, thing too is, I mean, the real problem too is eventually the public catches up on a lot of this stuff, right? So even if markets are being driven to the race to the bottom in terms of deregulation, we hide what's going on. So we put really strict legislation so you can't trespass on a farmer's land, so you can't see what's going on, right? It's all about this hiding of what's going on. Normally, if people are hiding things, that's not really where the ethics, right? Ethics comes in when you start saying, no, I'm open to showing what I'm doing to others. So I guess that's a really key issue, is that you need to provide, even if you're not going to impose laws that stop the worst, if you aren't creating an environment whereby those who want to achieve higher ethical standards, or the 90% who are good producers in terms of the ethics, that they have a favorable space in the way the market is operating, that's serious. And I'm not so sure there can't be good enforcement of these laws. With satellite imagery, it's unclear why you couldn't very easily see where producers have gotten rid of wetlands, and it would just be a matter of showing that to a judge and applying a levy on a corporation saying, yeah, we calculated you've gotten rid of this, we can see it from the satellite imagery, and we will charge you a fine of X amount of dollars. Like, you don't even have to go on a farmer's land to know. All you need to know is who owns the land, and here's the imagery. So it's not clear to me why there isn't, with modern technology, the ability to enforce in a fairly rigorous way wetland standards, right? And we can decide among producers, balance of producing and loss. The other thing too, of course, is when you have corporations treated differently. So why is it that a potash corporation gets rid of wetlands and has to replace them 2 times, 3 times, but then an agricultural corporation doesn't, right? So when you are not uniformly applying the law, for me, that's actually a question of corruption, right? Or if the citizens aren't getting a return on value for their land that's being put into private production, or not their land, but their water and the wetlands, again, that suggests corruption to me, right? It's not just, there's a transfer of earnings with no compensation, right? So I guess I get a little more upset in terms of the citizen interest around these things and the lack of enforcement, because I really think there is a land grab going on, and people are getting away with a lot of things they shouldn't be. And if people knew what was actually going on the land, there would be a deeper outrage, because it affects the heart, right? I drove to Saskatoon. Every time I drive to Saskatoon, it gets more and more barren on that landscape. I saw a coyote crossing the road and I thought, where the heck are you even going? There's nothing left here for you as a wild species for the distance I can see. So I think there is a real need for rebalancing, and I think it has a lot to do with corporate agriculture and the incentives and disincentives that currently exist or don't exist.
Expanding on that a bit, Margot, one of the questions ends up being the law, especially concerning drainage. It doesn't appear it's being enforced or not much, and that's sort of what Roger was getting at. So what I'd have to ask, what are the ramifications when laws are enforced by governments making them? Like, you think you make a law, isn't it for enforcement to be enforced? And can the government legally just ignore the laws and not enforce them, essentially, or do very little?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. And in this context of agricultural drainage and the drainage permits, right, I think the biggest slap on the wrist would be the provincial auditor writing a report, and I think they did, saying how many acres of Saskatchewan land are being illegally drained without permits. So I know that happens, and then they put pressure on the Water Security Agency to actually address that, right? So I think they are taking steps to address getting the proper permits for the drainage that is going on. But of course, this is a gargantuan task ongoing. And they probably did the low-hanging fruit, the easier ones, and we'll see what's left to happen. I like Roger's idea of satellite imagery, but it makes me think of Big Brother watching all of us all the time, and artificial intelligence spitting out tickets. Right. So I get slightly nervous about this, but having said that, the accounting, verification, and reporting on carbon sinks, eventually thinking about satellite imagery and the intensity of greenness that is one of the indicators of carbon, right? Like, these are places that technology is moving, and we need to start having the discussion about not just the big stick about retaining wetlands, but the carrot of managing carbon. So Roger was talking about food, and I am wholly behind feeding the world, but not at the expense of other things. So one good way of bringing in those national discussions is to look at the climate modeling of socioeconomic pathways that actually consider the balancing of food versus pasture land versus natural land and forestry. And these are big decisions that governments need to be thinking about, and not just Canadian governments, but provincial and municipal, is how the decisions we make on the landscape in relation to development and climate change, water quality, and the future inform one another. And this is bringing people back into a common discussion. And I know in the Saskatchewan landscape, from being there, starting out with the climate change discussion isn't often the way to do it, but we do eventually get that way because it's a very short-term viewpoint to think that maximizing my crop and my production area this year in making a bit more money this year is going to be a good thing at the expense of thinking long-term. And we're in wet years, we're in dry years, and trying to think very creatively about what's going to happen in the future, which is more wet years and more dry years and more extremes, and how we're going to manage that. And I think both Catherine and Roger have mentioned this, that keeping water on the land for those dry years, or keeping water in aquifers or storage for those dry years at the municipal level, but also at the agricultural producer level, is becoming more and more important. And not just water, but thinking of moving to perennial crops, because the roots retain that carbon and it's less disruptive to the cycle than annual crops. And that, we've been great adapters in the past with winter wheat, et cetera, et cetera. Like, this is where we may be moving in the future to be that bread basket that we want to continue to be into the future.
Good, yes. we're talking about the, sort of the law as being how to hold landowners accountable. Catherine, are there other ways to hold, to society hold landowners accountable for their actions other than laws and, through regulations? I don't know about public shunning or, doing those sort of things. And in the same context, how do you hold, and we use the term landowners to take in everyone, but how do you hold other types of landowners than family farms or that, like corporations or the absentee landowners or privately investment companies? How do you lead them accountable to their actions and responsible to society?
Well, I'm going to harken back to the first thing I talked about needs and goals. As a way to talk about what Margot just said about short-term versus long-term, and Roger talking about our reward structure and penalizing structure, which actually forces more short-termism, which is already our problem, right? Because we're calculating things on a very short-term basis, even though we're now dealing with problems that we have to think beyond the horizon, or we're not going to work. So in some ways it's ironic, because what Roger brought in is the idea of we need kind of international agreements and regulations and laws in order to keep a level playing field, right? So that some people are not having higher costs for doing the right thing and the race for the bottom. But as Margot points out, we need more local enforcement of things, because the local understands the conditions. It's more flexible than having authoritarian top-down land. So if we've got these authority groups that are watershed groups that are thinking about what ifs and what do we do here and how do we develop those kind of policies there, that can be much more flexible. And if it's there, it helps people not jump right to the immediate short term, what do we do today so that we're surviving this week? So one of the ways to do that is with social norms, that local enforcement is around keeping an eye on agreements that we've made in common. And they're a very powerful force that we are inclined to want to at least present ourselves as abiding by whatever our social expectations are. So as Roger talked about hiding, well, that's why we're hiding, is because we want that reputation, which matters to all of the things that you listed. It matters to us personally, but it matters to corporations too. And it matters to external companies, etc. They also have that social goal, even if they're just a profit-making company, because we're social creatures. So if your reputation is you're corrupt, that's going to really ruin your bottom line. And who's more likely to know that you're cheating? Well, it'll be your neighbors, because you can see the water coming across your land, or all of that. So social evaluation, shaming isn't right, but if it's more that you don't get the benefits of the community if you have a bad reputation, because you're not acting in a trustworthy way. And so when people notice that you are not being trustworthy, that you're corrupt, as Roger says, some of the benefits of the collective get withdrawn from you. You don't get the good stuff from society, etc. So having strong kind of community, changing our reward structure so that it really emphasizes that kind of community flexibility, community the setting of expectations and the best thing for everybody else, and putting our rewards to that actually is a way to solve some of the global stuff as well.
Okay, no, that sounds good. Expanding on that, when I did the watershed plan for the lower Souris watershed, one of the things that the provincial government asked about was whether or not the complaint process or some sort of resolution process could be done at that local level. And the local people didn't really want that. And I don't know if it's aspect of criticizing or being the enforcer against their neighbor, or not wanting sort of local politics, getting involved in that sort of thing. But so Margot, what do you think needs to happen for stakeholders to come together at the local level and make it work, essentially, both the agriculture and the environmental side of it? I don't want to separate them like that, but have them come together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. And to me, the public policy term is these windows of opportunities, and the education term is these opportunities for constructive conversations, right? So it's really, when does it arise? And in certain watersheds that I've done research with, we've had all over the map where drainage has resulted in fistfights at local meetings, right? We don't want that happening. But then there's other examples where coming together to talk in the time of either flood, when people do want to talk because there's predictions coming down the river in the next couple months that are going to be very harmful. So the people come together to have a discussion about what to do with those predictions of water coming down. And I'm thinking, specifically in the southeast part of our province, or in the north mid-center of Manitoba, where our dams are draining into Manitoba. And these predictions have happened, and government and people have come together. So it's taking those opportunities wherever they may arise, and in whichever context, whether it's flooding or whether it is drought, and extending the conversation, not just dealing with the disaster at hand or the hazard at hand, but extending it and keeping the momentum going, I think is really, really important. Not letting it drop off the radar just because the risk has abated, but using it as an opportunity to discuss the flip side of the hazard, whether it's the drought side or the opposite, in the context of a whole system, a social ecological system, that we have our livelihoods, we have our heritage, we have our Indigenous people so tied to the land that we need to learn from the Indigenous people about the land. So we need to take those opportunities to do it in a joined up, a very deep fashion. And I think it's leadership, not just in the local level, but it could be at the municipal level, and it could be at the provincial level. And I think most importantly, though, it's the institutions, the local institutions. Even if it's a provincial environmental society, that's still a good local institution, because often the provincial crown corporations or government, they don't want to get involved. And then often there's certain institutions that it's a hot potato for, and you have to appreciate and respect their hesitation in getting involved, because we know from our watershed groups on the landscape, it's just like municipal governments on the landscape. We have what we call in Saskatchewan the hockey wars of municipalities who won't join together to get common source water because they've been fighting over hockey or basketball for 2 or 3 decades. And so they're just not going to join together, even though it makes perfect sense to cooperate on source water and water, drinking water or sewage or whatever it might be. So, you know, this is Saskatchewan, it's complicated. But there are leaders that we all kind of know, some of them are here, that can bring the people together for a discussion. And this is where I guess social science and humanities, I think, is so important, because often we leave it with a government bureaucrat, and then we want to hear from a natural scientist about what's happening on X, Y, or Z. And then we have people, right? So bringing in the people like my esteemed panelists here that talk a little bit broader than just the hazard at hand and the natural science that's going to give us our technocratic, technological answer or solution. And we don't need to hear from anybody else. We're just going to fix it, and it's going to take a lot of money, and we're going to get it from the government and move along, right? It's having those discussions that a lot of times, my personal opinion, there might be a solution that's a lot less expensive than a big shiny plant that will fix some of our woes that are happening out there in our landscape.
Right, yeah. And that's one of the biggest things I learned in watershed planning was the worst time to talk about how to deal with the drought is when there's a drought going on, or how to deal with flooding when there's flooding going on. The emotional aspect of it just overtakes everything, and it's just poor. I think we've covered a lot or most of what I've been trying to touch on, and perhaps we'll take a few questions from the audience now, if there has been any. I can't see them, so I'll let Chuck sort of express those.
Okay, so I see there's a few questions here. How is it that we elect representatives that work with civil servants to come up with legislation and laws? Those laws are then passed in our legislature. After we do this, the politicians create policies that ignore the legislation and cherry pick portions of to benefit only a few. How do we get them to enact full legislation when it comes to the environment?
Margot, do you want to take that?
It would have been nice to have examples. And I assume, without knowing, the questions around drainage, that we've passed drainage laws, and that's the cherry picking, is we've benefited certain agricultural producers with these new drainage laws that have come in. I assume that's what the question is getting at. And then we've ignored, as I mentioned, that 1995 water policy that's kind of just gone away because the sponsor, the Crown Corporation, no longer exists.
I think a part of that can also be and I know this from internal in the Water Security Agency when I used to work there, is the aspect of thinking that you need to stick, and yet not having any dedicated people to sort of do that, or limiting the legislation is very broad, including multiple fines in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. But if you ask the Water Security Agency how many people they've ever taken to court, it was just a decade ago 0. And you know, they could actually capture back the money for constructing or blocking areas, and they don't do that. And you know, it's almost like a political will or mindset coming from that we got the law, but you know, we haven't carried through with the compliance and that sort of thing. Like, how would that go?
Yeah, so yeah, it's the cherry picking that I lose my focus on, because I'm not sure exactly what that means. But for sure, drainage, we've always had the requirement to get a drainage permit, right? And then there was the argument, well, we'd had all those grandfathered permits. So which is grandfathered, specifically which drainage work is grandfathered and which isn't, was a problem. So now every drainage needs to be permitted. So that's cleared up that problem. And the province is moving towards that. But having said that, again, it's complicated because our topography in Saskatchewan, and southern Saskatchewan especially, keeps changing. So even with respect to LIDAR and flood mapping, like this is a changing constant. So very, very important to approach it from more a social science way, where we're thinking about infrastructure that needs protection. And I see drainage the same. So to answer the question, to get to that, we've always had the ability to complain about illegal drainage and to make a complaint to the Water Security Agency, et cetera, et cetera. But what that triggers then is we need the engineers and the qualified personnel to document that this is an illegal drainage and it's impacting me, right? So that takes money and time, and then it takes professionals and qualified people to look at the reports and negotiate through the correct answer, whether it was illegal, et cetera, et cetera. So having done some research with agricultural producers and municipalities, that was a long, expensive, delayed process. And it continues to exist on the books, but it's a really good example of you can have a law, but it's not really easily accessed or timely accessed because of the nature of the beast. And I think it would be impossible to change that. And I guess one way to look at it too is to say, okay, we could, let's say, put a 30-day limit so that people get redressed for these drainage issues within 30 days, but we're going to need a staffing component of these water experts. And I'm not even sure, because it's really hard to hire a hydrologist, just to let you know, in Saskatchewan. So we need these experts, and it's going to cost, I don't know what, $2 million. I'm making it up. Would you increase your taxes? Can we increase property taxes, agricultural property tax, to pay for this? Bureaucracy that we need to do this policing. So, you know, those are the kind of choices and the problems that government's up against. It's dollars and priorities.
Yeah. Go ahead, Roger, you have something to add with that?
Yeah, I think too, I mean, from the kind of ethical side of things, it's also good governance practice. So if you think of whether it's government or private sector, organizations have spent a lot of time trying to figure out what are their overall missions, what are their principles, whereby they do things, and then making sure that the policies and so on that they adopt reflect those principles. Now, if we're talking about the whole question of how do we balance sort of the various interests, the environmental interests, the social interests, the economic interests, there is a whole language around that we've been working on for the last 30 years, and that's called sustainable development. And also setting up the measures, long-term measures for sustainable development. So we have now what are called the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And so in a way, if we start having those key indicators of a broader sense of progress, not just monetary progress, but all these other elements of progress, then we can kind of get a sense of, you know, are our individual policies and laws contributing to that overall picture or not? And if not, why not? The other thing we have to think about too is designing the governance structure so there aren't conflicts of interest, where there is that more general long-term interest involved. And so, for instance, I've looked, I mean, not closely, but I've looked at conservation and development authorities and the interests of those who are on the governance of those. And it doesn't seem to me that the long-term general social interest is represented on those. And so how would you actually structure the conservation side of those? I mean, are they actually shutting down illegal drainage? Because they have the authority to do that, conservation and development authorities. It's not just the government, but these authorities as well. And what are their various incentives? Or have they been structured in a way that they don't shut these things down because of, you know, there being conflicts of interest on those boards? And so there's some sort of basic kind of governance things that, you know, you can often design things badly or you can design them well. The other thing too is the complaints process. To have a neighbor complain against their neighbor is a pretty hard way to initiate a legal process, right? I mean, that's what Catherine was saying about sort of social cohesion. Why design it that way? You know, if you had, you know, conservation officers who get a tip who then go in and take a look around and they make the complaint, right? Maybe that's a much better way to do that, right? So anyway, a lot of ethical issues, but sustainable development, there's, again, this whole resource for us to use in terms of the way we think about things and the way we implement policies and programs.
A lot easier said than done, complex, and you know, it's not like a guy speeding down the highway and just give him a ticket for 120. It's just not that easy. Chuck, was there any other questions that come from the audience?
Yeah, I've got another one here. So the new trespassing laws were mentioned. And so sort of mentioned that in terms of seeing what's happening on the land or not being able to see what's happening on the land. Philosophically speaking, is trespassing on a city lot any different than trespassing in the country? For example, club root disease can spread when someone drives into a piece of land from another infected area. Is that enough to justify the new trespassing laws?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the question is what was the purpose of those laws, and do those purposes meet a general public standard? And so, you know, if it's a question of monitoring, then of course, you know, you would probably want to have public officials who have the responsibility to monitor that, doing that kind of monitoring. It's not clear to me that they are doing that monitoring though, right? So the issue there is if there aren't sort of publicly accountable officials, just like, and with any corporation, right? You have audits, you have ways of checking what's going on. You check the amount of emissions and so on. So I guess the question is, in the absence of that, then the question is, well, you know, and I'm not sure. I mean, a lot of the concerns are indigenous rights around getting to ceremonial sites. Also, the onus of, you know, the burden of proof has completely shifted. Now you have to ask permission. Before you had to have it intentionally, you know, you had to have the restriction. So even that whole shift in burden. And the other question too was, what was the cause for change, right? What was motivating it? Was it a problem that there was all of a sudden a huge amount of new people trespassing in some kind of a way? Or was the issue actually one of hiding? Who wanted this and why? And I did not hear a good public policy rationale for the change in the law from that perspective. The difference between urban and rural areas, again, it would depend upon you know, what are the public and private concerns that may differ from an urban and a rural area, right? And so you'd have to look at those contexts to see what would be the appropriate law about trespass in those different contexts.
Good. Chuck, do you have a question more in the realm for Catherine?
So here's a question for all. Not all people living in rural communities are large farmers who drain. Many rural people have small properties, other sources of income, and are concerned about having
You just went
habitat loss around them, but they are very reluctant to complain publicly about the practices they see on the changing landscape. Owners and farmers are determining what happens to the larger landscapes and watersheds because it serves their private interests. What can be done to amplify the voices of the silent majority of rural citizens who are losing the quality of life and the environment around them?
Catherine, would you like to have the first go with that? Did you get enough of that?
Sure. I mean, I think that's part of what I was talking about, is that we're groupish and we can easily be triggered into a kind of isolated mindset and not thinking about our common goals. So people who have small land holdings in rural areas, they have some of the same goals of autonomy and connection, community connection, as people that are large landholders. And yet, because they're kind of seen as in a different category, they feel reluctant to enter into the conversation, or they're kept from entering into those conversations. So the kinds of things that Margot's talking about, of looking for opportunities for meaningful conversation, getting that set up, not in a crisis situation, but just as a local conversation of management to make sure that some of those people are invited, that the more diversity we have around those conversations actually improves the quality of our thinking, our imagining of alternatives, that even though it makes the conversation itself a little more challenging, the quality is so much better if we've got different perspectives.
Good. Yep, exactly. Do you have any more questions there,
Yep.
Chuck?
Here's another one. There's an interesting development called the Treaty Land Sharing Network that seems to reflect both the ethical and legal relationship between First Nations users and settler groups. Can they comment on the approach to commonalities?
Who'd like to have a go with that one?
Well, I can. But
Okay.
the question is the approach to commonality?
Yeah, I think they're referring to this this Treaty Land Sharing Network.
Yeah.
And sort of commenting in that approach.
Yeah, I think it's really exciting, and it's really thinking about land in another way, which other cultures do and Indigenous people do, right? Like ownership of land, and my understanding, what I've read and been told, is that it's foreign to Indigenous people to think that they could have actually transferred the land to the British government because that was Mother Earth, right? Not able to transfer it, not even having the language in Cree to transfer private property, like all of that stuff, because it's very foreign in the culture. So what happened at the treaties, right, is very different. But even as an example, in many places in Europe, people don't own their house. They have a 99-year lease, right? Property isn't conceived of the same way that we do here in North America, where we get a title and it's ours, right? Even though we acknowledge that our lifetime is limited. So thinking about property in an extremely long time frame, I think is really exciting, because this treaty land sharing is thinking of exactly that we are here, and often our agricultural producers, we're no longer handing our land down to our children. They're not interested, right? So thinking about our land that's farmland in a broader context, it's really consistent with some of the ideas around thinking of 7 generations and decision making in the context of the past 3 and the future 3 generations and our current, right? 7 generations, which is kind of an Indigenous way of thinking in some Indigenous groups, or thinking of property in this way. So I think it's really, from my perspective, and only my opinion here, like it's a good idea, a good action in relation to reconciliation and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
Okay, Catherine, do you have a
Yeah, I just want to say that this is a good example of some of the things I'm talking about, in the sense that there's some really excellent stories coming out about people that are doing this kind of land sharing, developing this kind of respectful relationship and looking for common goals, even though people have very different beliefs and ideas and values, as Margot talked about, and they're learning from each other. So the landowner in that sharing network, as Indigenous people use the land and talk about it, give them information about the heritage of the land and other sorts of things, they learn some new ideas about how to manage this property. And the landowner talking about what they're doing and how this is happening can also educate the other people that are learning the land, that are using the land. So that kind of respectful relationship where they're listening and learning from each other has actually created some good new tricks that are at a very local level about this particular kind of property. So I also think it's a really exciting experiment that we're doing here in Saskatchewan.
Did you have a perspective on that, Roger?
Yeah, I mean, it's maybe this is from my philosophy, but you learn about yourself by encountering the other, right? You actually discover and understand your own ideas better when you engage in conversation with somebody who doesn't share those ideas necessarily. Similarly, you know, we're a technocratic society, but we learn about our processes by engaging nature, which is quite other, right? I mean, as scholars, we always plunk ourselves down and force natural areas because of this. It's a source of creativity and discovery. And so it's also very satisfying to discover one's different cultural traditions by encountering other cultures. And so to the extent this process allows for that, I mean, I'm a philosopher of religion, so the ability to look at different faith traditions, religious traditions, and then encountering different spiritual traditions, indigenous traditions, invariably enhances that understanding, right? So within settler culture, right, you think of the Judeo-Christian tradition and you think of the covenant with Noah, and that was a covenant with all peoples, but with all creatures too, right? It was a guarantee to all habitats that every species, which is a very powerful part of that tradition that was only, for me, made real when I started engaging indigenous spirituality, seeing nature as teacher, nature as medicine, and then rediscovering these elements that are so profound within these other traditions as well. So it is an opportunity, and it is so satisfying to rediscover and reimagine one's own culture and or understand it better. So it's the encounter with the other is really important, and that's why wilderness areas historically have been so important.
No, good, all good points. Should we take one more question, Chuck? Is there one more question?
Sure.
Or should I wrap up?
Yeah. So one more question here. Lots of discussion around the stick talk, but what about the effective use of carrots and incentives to change behavior, and consumers willing to pay more for products in order to avoid the race to the bottom?
Who would like to take that one? Catherine, do you wanna have a go at that?
Sure. Again, this sort of brings into something else different. So as my fellow panelists have made a point, it's always complicated, and human beings are really complicated. And one of the things that's characteristic of us is that we have a negativity bias, that our attention is drawn to the negative. So that's why in these kind of conversations, or when we're thinking of policies, we think of punishment or prevention or what we want to stop first. And so it takes a bit of extra thought and energy, self-regulation, assistance from the context for us to think about, well, what would we rather replace that with? What is it that we're trying to build towards? And so Margot mentioned things like some of the things that we need as a culture. We need to sequester carbon. We need to provide ourselves with water insurance from the landscape, mitigation of both floods and droughts. We need to continue to feed large numbers of people. So those are the carrots, really. And so if we can structure the conversation around what we're trying to build and move problem solving in that direction, we'll probably get a lot less of this groupishness than when we focus entirely on what we want to stop.
Good point. Okay, well, I'd like to sincerely thank all three of you, Dr. Petrie, Dr. Hurlbert, and Dr. Arbuthnot, for speaking with on this panel today, and a very complex and complicated discussion and issue for both the agricultural community and the environmental community. You can find more information about farmland drainage and the wetland impacts to the environment on the Citizens Environmental Alliance Facebook channel. Please like, follow, and share, as they say. You can also find all the recordings from this and previous conferences on the SIA YouTube channel. Our next session is going to be tomorrow at 10 a.m. Please join us when Dr. Masaki discusses his research on groundwater recharge in the prairies and the implications regarding the effects of land management practices and climate change on groundwater recharge. This will be the link between, wetlands and groundwater, and a lot about what we didn't know we're getting to learn more about. So thank you very much for attending today as well, and have a good rest of your day, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Bye all.
Thanks.